Gendry first realized something unusual about his bloodline on a brisk morning in the cramped forge just off the Street of Steel. He was barely more than a boy then, strong-armed from hours hammering hot metal into swords for gold cloaks and wealthy merchants, though no more aware of the full significance of his heritage than a blacksmith's apprentice should be. Yet a strange tension had brewed around him for weeks, a sense that the whispers in the alehouses and back alleys were converging on his name. The mystery of his parentage had always been a faint itch in his mind, a question he never dared ask too loudly. But in this city, secrets had a way of seeping into the gutters before springing forth like a torrent. It began innocently enough, the old master armorer inspecting his features, a hush passing over those who noticed the boy's coal-black hair and deep blue eyes. There was something about him that drew glances, murmurs, and eventually the cautious approach of men bearing hidden agendas. He had known no father and remembered little of his mother, save that she had once been blonde and kind, or so he thought. Memories of her were fleeting shapes, half lost to time. In his earliest days, he had been given over to the armorer Tobo Mott, who took him in not purely out of kindness, but because a man of means had paid handsomely to see Gendry raised with a craft. That man, he later learned, was none other than Lord Varys, acting for someone in the Red Keep. All the boy ever knew was the clang of hammers, the hiss of steel, and the occasional reminder from Tobo to keep his head down. Such an existence left little room for pondering lineage, but in a city as vast and gossipy as King's Landing, rumors were impossible to extinguish. Those rumors, it turned out, were on the lips of the Goldcloaks themselves. Men who took extra notice of the boy with broad shoulders and black hair that curled just so at the nape of his neck. They watched him from across the courtyard whenever they came to collect new arms. Some were discreet, others openly curious, and Gendry wondered if he was doing something wrong. That wariness became fear when, shortly after King Robert Baratheon's untimely demise, new men in gold cloaks came searching for stray bastards. The city was in an uproar, people crying out that the seeds of King Robert's lust lay scattered everywhere, and rumors spread that the new King Joffrey was rounding up potential threats. Gendry found himself suddenly the focus of half-lidded stares and quiet questions, asked by men who offered him ale and tried to glean details about his mother. But the words that truly changed his life came from a man wearing a patched cloak and a battered breastplate. It was in the corner of a tavern at the edge of Flea Bottom, where Gendry had gone to bring new horseshoes for a stable. The man caught him by the wrist and said in a voice ragged with age and strong drink, "I'd watch yourself, boy. You've got the look of your father." He paused, took in Gendry's wide eyes, and leaned closer. "Not your blacksmith father, either." The man's breath smelled of sour wine and regret, but there was sincerity in his tone. Gendry felt a strange coldness settle in his stomach, yet he managed only a skeptical laugh and an uneasy shrug. That was the moment the seeds took root. Knowledge of that rumor was like a spark in dry tinder. If Gendry had any doubts, they were stoked by the repeated stares, the hush that fell whenever he crossed the yard, the looks of recognition on the faces of men who had once served the old king. King Robert Baratheon had fathered more than a few bastards, so the tale went. So it wasn't so outlandish a notion, certainly not if one looked at Gendry's square jaw, broad chest, and the black of his hair. But it was also a dangerous notion, for bastards of royal blood often faced short lifespans once new rulers took their seats. Yet, for all that, Gendry knew he was done living in ignorance. His life was his anvil, and the truth was the hammer shaping him. He pressed old Tobo Mott for answers. The armorer, cornered and red-faced, let slip that Gendry's mother was a tavern girl with golden hair, but more importantly, he admitted that someone in the Red Keep had funded Gendry's apprenticeship. "It was for your own good, boy," Tobo said. "They wanted to keep you safe. You were never to be told. That had always been the plan. Keep the bastard hidden in plain sight, with a trade that would keep him out of trouble." But secrets fester and times had changed. King Robert was gone, and Joffrey Baratheon, false born of incest as some whispered, sat uneasily on the throne. With him reigned Queen Cersei, and behind her loomed the Lannister power in all its gold and ruthlessness. So Gendry left the forge. He did so without fanfare, donning a thick cloak and taking a handful of coin he had saved. He told Tobo that he would find his own path, for forging steel for men who might wish him dead was no life. The armorer did not stop him. In his eyes was the look of someone who quietly believed the boy was running toward his death. But Gendry was not so naive as all that. Perhaps he was not cunning like a lord, but he had the physical strength and the fresh sense that something great was at stake. That intangible feeling compelled him to survive, to learn more, to test this claim about his parentage. News of King Robert's bastards being hunted or disappearing entirely trickled through the city. Some spoke of gold cloaks dragging them away in the night, or bodies floating along the Blackwater Rush. Gendry realized with a grim set to his jaw that if he remained in King's Landing, he might be next. His flight from the city occurred under the auspices of a trading caravan heading north, caravans that needed skilled hands for wagon repairs. Along the way, he crossed paths with those who had little love for the Lannisters. Several men from the stormlands recognized his face and the shape of his build. One or two quietly asked if he was indeed the bastard of Robert Baratheon. At first, Gendry refused to confirm or deny anything, but the rumors persisted and the men traveling north with him began to treat him with more wariness, even a glimmer of respect. As the caravan rumbled beyond the farmland that encircled the city, Gendry lingered in the wagons, listening to travelers speak of the Baratheon words, "Ours is the fury." He listened to tales of Robert in his youth, of how the Storm Lord once overthrew the Targaryen dynasty alongside Eddard Stark and Jon Arryn, forging a kingdom through rebellion. The men told Gendry stories of how the Baratheons were big men, strong as the storms that lashed their coasts. Gendry felt a strange stirring within him, part pride, part terror. For if he was indeed Robert's, then the current occupant of the Iron Throne was a direct threat to his life. It was at an inn near the crossroads that Gendry found a man who would change the course of his life. The man was named Harbert Storm, a bastard himself from the Stormlands, old enough to recall the rebellion. Harbert was no knight, nor was he particularly wealthy, but he possessed a sharp mind and a cunning glint in his eyes. He approached Gendry one evening as the smith's apprentice was mending a broken wagon wheel. "Boy," he said quietly, "you've got no notion of the trouble that hunts you." Gendry stiffened, but Harbert raised a conciliatory hand. "I mean you no harm, but let us speak plainly. It said you're a bastard of Robert Baratheon. If that's so, there's blood in your veins that could change the realm." Gendry thought it absurd. He was a low-born lad, taught to keep his mouth shut and do his work. The idea of toppling King Joffrey and the Lannisters was as distant to him as the lonely moon above. But Harbert insisted, "Men talk, boy. The rightful line is said to flow from Robert's seed, not from Cersei's incestuous children with her twin brother. The only reason Joffrey sits the throne is because the Lannisters were quick with a blade and cunning with politics. Yet half the realm hates them, and the other half fears them." Gendry kept his eyes lowered, focusing on the wheel, but he listened to every word. "If you can prove your blood, you might rally those who were loyal to Robert. The Stormlands would follow a true Baratheon, especially one with the look of their king. They hate the Lannisters more with every passing day. And that's not to say anything of the Northern Lords. If the rumor is true that Joffrey is no rightful heir, the Starks might line up behind you if you can show them the truth." Still, Gendry said little. What proof could he possibly have? He owned no ring, possessed no paper proclaiming him legitimate. Even so, Harbert coaxed him, promising that somewhere in the Stormlands there might be records, or men who had known Gendry's mother. Possibly there were midwives or old letters from Robert himself. Gendry wasn't convinced, but the notion glowed hot in his mind, as if stoked by the breath of a forge. When they parted ways, Harbert offered an unsettling piece of wisdom. "If you do nothing, you remain a target forever. Joffrey will never rest easy with you alive. You might think you're safe in some corner of the realm, but the Lannisters have deep coffers and long arms. They will find you one day or another." In the days that followed, Gendry wrestled with the idea. He could remain on the run, an anonymous bastard forging iron in rural towns, or he could stake a claim to a heritage that might cost him his life. But the realm was in upheaval. People whispered of Stannis Baratheon claiming he was the rightful heir, and of Renly Baratheon conjuring a great host through alliances in the Reach. At the same time, rumors flew that Robb Stark in the north had declared himself king in the north. War loomed, the faint thunder of hooves and swords echoing across the land. Perhaps Gendry thought if there was a chance to stand for something, for his own right to exist, this was the time. Better to die as Robert's son than live cowering in flea-bitten inns. Fortune or fate led him toward the stormlands, traveling in the company of a small merchant caravan. It was there he encountered his first significant allies, soldiers who had served under Robert. One, a grizzled man missing half an ear, recognized Gendry's face almost instantly. "By the gods," he muttered under his breath. "That's the spitting image of our old king when he was a lad at Storm's End." The soldier went by the name Ser Jon Caffrin, a hedge knight from a minor branch of House Caffrin. Over a campfire, Ser Jon told Gendry that if he truly was Robert's child, proof would not be so hard to find. "Some of the lords in the Stormlands remember the old days. They would remember your mother too, if she truly was who they say. You'd be wise to speak with them, but choose carefully. Some lords bend their knees easily to whichever side holds power. Others remain fiercely loyal to the Baratheon name." Gendry had no illusions about the next step being simple. Even if he could convince a handful of lords that he was Robert's blood, they would surely question his birth's legitimacy. As a bastard, he had no legal claim, unless, of course, there was a way to call Joffrey's claim into doubt and then rally those who despised him. The war had just begun to tear the Seven Kingdoms apart. Stannis claimed the throne based on the line of succession and Joffrey's rumored illegitimacy. Renly claimed it based on popular support and the alliance with House Tyrell. Gendry's arrival in this swirl of ambition and chaos might stir the pot beyond all reason. Within a fortnight, Gendry found himself near Storm's End, the ancient seat of House Baratheon. He felt a jolt of awe seeing the colossal fortress perched against the sea, a testament to centuries of defiance against storms and enemies alike. Its walls and towers loomed as if grown from the very rock. As he stood at a distance on the cliffside, salt spray in the air, he felt a tug inside him. This was his father's home, in a sense, though no one at Storm's End knew him. He had no formal right to pass through its gates. Yet he was drawn to it the way a piece of iron is drawn to a magnet. It so happened that the fortress was embroiled in tension. Lord Stannis was away, mustering forces and ships at Dragonstone, while some minor Baratheon bannermen had remained behind to hold Storm's End in his name. As Gendry approached the outer gates with Ser Jon at his side, the guards stood at attention, uncertain. "I've business with the Castellan," Ser Jon said, offering the battered seal of House Caffrin. "I bring a lad with a claim worth hearing." They were escorted inside under watchful eyes. The great hall of Storm's End was a cavernous space, open and imposing. Torches lined the walls, their light flickering on old tapestries. Gendry felt the weight of his father's shadow there, imagining how Robert might have strode through the hall in his youth. No, not imagining, he almost felt it in his bones. The Castellan was a man named Courtnay Penrose, but in this altered timeline, let us say he still lived. He was a loyal retainer of House Baratheon, trusting in Stannis' claim. Yet his loyalty was first to Robert's memory, for he had guarded Storm's End through the siege during Robert's rebellion. It was Ser Jon who spoke at length, explaining how he had encountered this young man on the road, a man who carried the look of Robert Baratheon in his face. Gendry, for his part, knew he must speak boldly but truthfully. He recounted his upbringing in King's Landing, the suspicious way he had been funded to become an armorer's apprentice, the hush that always accompanied talk of his mother. Ser Courtnay listened, his brow furrowed. He asked pointed questions about Gendry's features, about the color of his eyes, about the shape of his jaw. At last, Penrose allowed that he did recall hearing rumors that Robert had sired a child on a tavern girl from the Crownlands, a woman with golden hair. But rumors were not proof. "Even if you are his blood," the Castellan said thoughtfully, "you are still a bastard. The laws of the realm do not smile upon bastards, particularly not with so many lords vying for the crown." You'll find no shortage of knights who'd see you dead rather than risk complicating Stannis's claim. Gendry's hands clenched involuntarily. I don't claim to be king, he said, voice trembling slightly. But I do not want to die for something I never asked for. Word is spreading that Joffrey's no true Baratheon. If that is so, and I am truly Robert's son, then I might have some right to speak, even if it's only to rally men to a different cause. Ser Courtenay's gaze flicked to the battered sword strapped to Gendry's side. The youth carried it more for show than real knightly skill, though he was strong from forging steel. And you think men would follow a blacksmith's apprentice into war? Ser Jon interjected. If the realm truly believes Joffrey is illegitimate, they may also wonder if another Baratheon-blooded candidate might claim the throne. This boy's face alone might rally small folk and lesser lords who adored Robert. They do not love Stannis, for he is cold, nor do they love Renly, for he is dead. And in this timeline, let us place Renly's demise around this same period. But they remember Robert fondly. Perhaps they would see him reborn in this lad. Gendry felt a surge of uncertainty. This was not the life he had ever wanted. Yet the fear that clung to him since the day Goldcloaks appeared at his forge was real. Joffrey would never let him live free. If war was inevitable, it might be better to fight on his feet than die on his knees. But how was he to prove anything? Ser Courtenay, after a lengthy silence, said, I cannot bend the knee to you, boy, not while Lord Stannis claims the throne. My loyalty is sworn to the rightful Baratheon. Yet I cannot deny you do bear a resemblance. I have some suspicion that letters exist, letters written by Robert in his younger days, that might confirm the existence of a bastard. The question is, will men accept such proof in a time of war? He sighed, rubbing his temples. Remain here a while if you wish. I will see what I can discover. But if you're wise, you'll keep yourself hidden. There are those in every castle who would sell you to the Lannisters for enough gold. Thus began Gendry's time at Storm's End. He was given quarters in a modest wing of the castle, treated as neither prisoner nor honored guest. Ser Jon remained to watch over him, whispering that they had best be careful. Gendry spent days exploring the fortress, gazing at the storm-lashed sea, feeling that sense of belonging war with his fear. At night, he dreamed of King Robert's face. He had seen portraits or heard descriptions, never the man in the flesh. In the dream, Robert's eyes were both kindly and fierce, and Gendry awoke with his heart hammering. Word reached them that Stannis Baratheon was preparing his ships and men to sail for King's Landing. This was the moment in which the War of the Five Kings was truly beginning to coalesce, with Robb Stark holding the north, Balon Greyjoy crowning himself in the Iron Islands, and the Lannisters clinging to the throne for their boy King Joffrey. Gendry wondered if the realm could survive such strife. Yet the notion that he might have a role to play burned hotter than the coals of any forge he had worked. It was a few weeks later, long enough for Gendry to settle into the uneasy routine of Storm's End, that Ser Courtenay sent for him in the night. The castle's halls were quiet, save for the hiss of the wind outside. In a small solar, Courtenay Penrose stood with a letter unrolled on a table. It bore a faded seal, the crowned stag of House Baratheon. I found this among old correspondences, Penrose said, his voice low and urgent. It is from Robert, dated around the time your mother would have conceived. It does not name you specifically, but it acknowledges the babe in her belly, for whom I shall provide, though I cannot name him or claim him openly. He wrote this to a cousin. As you can see, Robert had ways of ensuring his bastards were given some coin or apprenticeship. But be warned, this is no open acknowledgement that you are that child. Gendry's eyes scanned the letter, his heart pounding. The script was bold, the language typical of the roguish style Robert was known for in his youth. It wasn't definitive, yet it was evidence enough that he was not some random child. If combined with his remarkable likeness to Robert, might it sway hearts? Penrose paced. Lord Stannis is rigid, lawful. He might see you as a threat or a tool. If you appear before him proclaiming your parentage, he may well have you hidden away or worse. He is not a man to share power easily. But there are others in the Stormlands who might see you as a rallying point for the men who loved Robert and despised the Lannisters. If you mean to move against Joffrey, or at least defend yourself against his huntsmen, you'll need a host at your back." Gendry swallowed hard. "I have no illusions about my status, but I'd rather join the fight than wait around to be murdered. The Lannisters, if they see me as a threat, they will come eventually." Penrose nodded gravely. "Then perhaps we must gather those bannermen who can be trusted. If any portion of the realm sees you as a figure worthy of following, you might muster an army. But you'd need a capable leader, a knight or a lord who can speak for you until you're more seasoned. Men won't follow an untested boy, Baratheon blood or no." It was Ser Jon who volunteered. Though a hedge knight of meager standing, he had a resolute spirit and a certain dogged loyalty to Robert's memory. "I served your father," he told Gendry. "It was only as a soldier in the ranks, but I saw him fight at the Trident. I saw the fury in his hammer, the unstoppable might of him. You look smaller, but the shape of your shoulders is the same. The same color hair, the same shade of eyes. I cannot claim to match your father's prowess, but I can be your sword and shield if you let me." So it was decided. Gendry, Ser Jon, and a small retinue of loyal Stormland men left Storm's End one evening, under the pretense of traveling to gather supplies. In truth, they meant to ride from one minor keep to another, drumming up support. They carried a copy of Robert's letter, a few personal items that might evoke memory, and Gendry's physical resemblance as their main argument. The plan was not to declare open rebellion yet, but to test the waters among the lesser lords. They had to be quiet about it, for should news reach Lannister ears or even Stannis, the repercussions could be dire. Their first successes were small. A petty lord who had served under Robert recognized Gendry's face at once and pledged a handful of knights. A landed knight who once saw Robert in a melee outside of Ashford declared that Gendry had the look of him. These men seemed invigorated by the idea that Robert's blood lived on in someone who might challenge the false King Joffrey. They prayed that Gendry would appear at the head of a host, forging the same unity Robert once had when he rebelled against the Mad King. However, not everyone was as welcoming. Some lords scoffed at the idea. "A bastard is still a bastard," they said. "We owe you no allegiance." Others were loyal to Stannis or found the notion of a new claimant to be dangerous. "We are already at war. We need no more pretenders," they insisted, slamming their gates. Worse yet, an undercurrent of fear pervaded the Stormlands. Lord Tywin Lannister was known for his ruthlessness. If a rebellious faction formed around some new Baratheon bastard, Tywin would send his forces south to crush them. And if that wasn't enough, there was rumor that Stannis had turned to strange magic on Dragonstone, a reality that frightened many. Despite these obstacles, Gendry's small band grew incrementally. There were knights and men-at-arms who had personal stories of Robert saving their lives or awarding them after some valorous deed. The memory of the old king's boisterous laughter and unstoppable warhammer was enough to kindle loyalty in some hearts. Word spread among the Stormlander smallfolk that the rightful blood of Robert walked among them, and it stirred a humble excitement. Farmers brought out bread and salt to greet Gendry, marveling at the face that so strongly evoked the beloved rebel king of old. They prayed for him to succeed, if only to rid them of the oppressive yoke of Lannister rule. As the war progressed, ravens flew all over the realm carrying tales of battles won and lost. The Lannisters fought Robb Stark in the Riverlands, Stannis and his fleet sailed to King's Landing, and the Tyrells joined with the Lannisters after Renly's death, ensuring a major blow to Stannis' hopes. Meanwhile, Gendry found himself with a small but growing band, perhaps 200 men-at-arms, some sworn swords, and a handful of minor lords who believed in his potential. They began calling him the Storm Bastard or the Blacksmith Prince, terms that made Gendry's cheeks burn. But the men seemed to relish the romantic notion, and Gendry began to feel the mantle of leadership settle on him. He was no fool, however. He knew that without forging stronger alliances, they could never hope to stand against the might of House Lannister. More importantly, with Stannis still claiming the throne and older brother to the late King Robert, Gendry found himself in a precarious political position. Did he mean to dethrone Stannis too? Or would he support Stannis if Stannis acknowledged him and offered him protection? The question gnawed at him. The men who followed him seemed determined to fight for him specifically, not Stannis. Stannis is too harsh, they would say. We want a king like Robert, one who understood the hearts of the common folk. But the reality was that Gendry had no illusions about wearing a crown. He only wanted to survive, and perhaps to punish those who had tried to kill Robert's bastards. If that meant seizing a throne or forging an alliance, he had no plan yet. He was still a blacksmith's apprentice in over his head. Events forced his hand. The news arrived that Stannis had been defeated at the Battle of the Blackwater. His ships burned by wildfire, his army broken. The Lannisters and Tyrells now dominated King's Landing, and Joffrey's hold on the Iron Throne seemed unassailable. Tywin Lannister became the hand of the king, and the realm trembled at the prospect of renewed Lannister aggression. In response, some Stormland houses that had sworn to Stannis found themselves adrift, uncertain who to follow. Enter the rumors of Gendry, the living image of Robert, who had avoided the madness of Blackwater Bay. The momentum behind Gendry's band suddenly grew. Men who wanted to keep the Baratheon dream alive flocked to him. Lords who felt spurned by Stannis' retreat or who mistrusted Melisandre's shadow magic thought perhaps the Storm Bastard might be a better champion of Robert's legacy. Others warned it was pure foolishness, that a bastard had no place leading armies. But the times were desperate. That was how Gendry came to hold a modest war camp in the Stormlands, nestled near a fortress called Greenstone. It had once been loyal to Stannis, but the Lady of the Keep, a distant cousin of the Baratheons, decided that Gendry's presence gave her renewed hope. She opened her gates, and a small host gathered. Banners bearing the crowned stag in black, though not quite the official Baratheon sigil, were pieced together by the local seamstresses, even if they had to place a bastard's bend in some symbolic fashion. Gendry found the entire affair both inspiring and terrifying. He stood among men who addressed him as "my lord," or even "my prince," though he tried to dissuade them. He spent his days practicing swordplay, hammer work, and conversing with the lords about strategy. He let Ser Jon and other experienced men command the troops, but he gradually learned how to project authority. When the first Lannister scouts entered the Stormlands in search of the rumored bastard, Gendry knew war was upon him. A band of red-cloaked riders bearing the Lion of Lannister advanced near Greenstone's outskirts, clashing with Gendry's outriders. 2 men died, and the Lannister party retreated, presumably to report back. That night, Gendry's council gathered in the main hall. They all turned to him expectantly. He realized, with a rush of dread, that they wanted him to make the final decision on how to respond. Should they remain in Greenstone and brace for a siege? Should they ride to meet the Lannisters in open battle? Should they attempt to form an alliance with other Stormland lords still on the fence? Gendry's chest tightened. He was just a blacksmith, but he forced himself to speak. "We cannot let ourselves be penned in," he said. "If the Lannisters think they can pick us off easily, they will. We should rally the local lords, muster more men if we can, and stand together in the open. If we hide behind walls, they'll starve us out, or they'll bring more men than we have. Better to move to strike where they are weak." It was crude strategy, but enough that the knights nodded in agreement. They started mapping out next steps, discussing which lords might join them if they rode deeper into the Stormlands. A sense of purpose filled the hall. Despite the fear, Gendry felt strangely alive, like a blade fresh from the forge. Over the next days, ravens flew, envoys were sent, and alliances were courted. The Storm Bastards' host swelled to nearly 1,000 men. Small by the standards of great houses, but formidable enough for a localized conflict. The Lannisters, embroiled in the war with Robb Stark up north, could not yet spare an entire army to crush Gendry, but they dispatched a smaller force under one of Lord Tywin's bannermen, Ser Adam Marbrand or perhaps another lesser knight, to assess and, if possible, quell the rebellion. Word also reached King's Landing, where Queen Cersei grew alarmed that another of Robert's bastards was stirring real trouble. Joffrey raged, demanding Gendry's head. But the Tyrells had their own concerns, and so the Lannister response was not as swift as it might have been if their position was more secure. fortune or the gods or some nameless force seemed to favor Gendry for a time. Among the common folk, a trickle of volunteers joined him, drawn by the legend of Robert's son. They brought homemade spears, rusty swords, or sometimes only pitchforks. Gendry saw the fervor in their eyes and felt a deep responsibility. He tried to help in the smithy whenever he could, forging new heads for spears, but his duties as a leader took precedence. Each night, he lay awake in a small cot in a corner tower of Greenstone, staring at the ceiling, wondering how he came to this. He had not asked for the power or the danger, but it had found him nonetheless. Then came a letter from the north. Astonishingly, it was from Robb Stark's camp. Word had reached the young wolf that a bastard of Robert Baratheon was gathering arms in the stormlands. The letter proposed a potential meeting or alliance. Robb Stark was aware that Joffrey was not the true heir, and if Gendry could lend men and disrupt Lannister operations in the south, the North might recognize him as a legitimate Baratheon heir if and when they overthrew King's Landing. Gendry could scarcely believe his eyes reading the letter. An alliance with the Starks was no small matter, but forging that alliance would require travel, risk, and negotiation. Some of Gendry's advisors feared it was a trick to lure him away and kill him, but others saw it as an opportunity. Gendry decided to respond in the affirmative. He would ride north to speak with representatives of the king in the north. He left most of his host behind under the command of Ser Jon and the Lady of Greenstone, with orders to hold the castle and continue mustering. He set out with a small retinue of skilled warriors, men he trusted deeply. The journey took them through the rain-lashed hills and across the Blackwater, avoiding major roads to slip past Lannister patrols. They saw evidence of war everywhere. Burnt farms, empty villages, terrified peasants. It weighed heavily on Gendry. His father had once rebelled, but that rebellion had ended quickly compared to this chaos. The realm was fracturing, and Gendry felt the dread of how many might die. They arranged to meet Lord Roose Bolton, one of Robb Stark's principal lords, who had marched a portion of the Northern Army to Harrenhal at some point in the war. The location was set near the ruins of an old, septoff-the-Rose Road, a place that had once been neutral ground. Gendry and his retinue arrived under the cover of dusk. The stone walls of the ruined sept cast long shadows in the moonlight, giving Gendry's men cause for unease. But soon they saw the torches of the northern party. Lord Bolton greeted them with his usual calm politeness, though his eyes were unsettlingly pale. Gendry did not trust Lord Bolton. He had heard rumors of flaying, of cruelty, but Robb Stark's letter insisted that Bolton spoke with the king in the North's authority. So Gendry forced himself to remain cordial. Their conversation was short and blunt. Bolton wanted assurances that Gendry truly was Robert's blood, that he had real men at his command, and that he intended to fight Joffrey rather than ally with the Lannisters. In return, Gendry wanted the North's recognition that if Joffrey fell, Gendry would be granted legitimacy, possibly by some royal decree once the war concluded. Bolton inquired about the possibility that Stannis might have a stronger claim. Gendry acknowledged that Stannis was Robert's older brother, but insisted that many Stormland lords disliked Stannis's reliance on foreign magic and harsh discipline. If Gendry could rally enough men, he might overshadow Stannis in the Stormlands at least. Bolton's lips curled in a half-smile. "You are forging quite the predicament, young man. The realm is already awash in blood, and you propose another rebellion within the rebellion. Still, the king in the north might find you useful, especially if you can tie down Lannister forces in the south. I will convey your words to his grace. If he deems it worthwhile, we can speak again on more substantial terms." Gendry left uneasy, uncertain if he had made progress or simply opened another dangerous front. Yet the idea that the North might see him as a legitimate force buoyed him. If Robb Stark accepted Gendry's lineage, perhaps other lords would follow suit. They parted ways with Bolton's group, heading back south. Along the way, Gendry's party was ambushed by Lannister outriders. The skirmish was brutal and quick. Gendry fought with a blacksmith's strength, wielding a hand-and-a-half sword with wide arcs that shattered a spear and caved in a man's helm. Yet they were outnumbered, and in the confusion, one of Gendry's close companions fell, skewered by a pike. Gendry took a shallow cut to the arm but managed to escape with the survivors into the dense forest. That night, nursing his wound, he felt the chill reality that war was no game. Each life he lost weighed on him. When they finally rejoined their main force near Greenstone, Gendry discovered that Lannister scouts had indeed ventured deeper into Stormland territory. Skirmishes had erupted on the roads, costing more lives. But amid the gloom, there was a beacon. A few more local lords had joined, swelling the host to nearly 2,000 men. Minor though it might appear compared to the massive armies of the great houses, it was still enough to pose a real threat if used wisely. Gendry found himself embraced by these new recruits, who admired his refusal to bend to the Lannisters and the living memory of Robert that he represented. Still, the question loomed: how to take the fight to Joffrey? A direct march on King's Landing was madness, especially after Stannis' defeat at the Blackwater. The Lannisters had the city heavily garrisoned, and the Tyrell alliance ensured they had bountiful resources. Gendry's advisors argued for raids, harassing supply lines, capturing smaller Lannister-held castles in the Stormlands, or possibly forging alliances with the Dornish, though Dorne's relationship with the Baratheons was complicated by old Targaryen loyalties. Another voice advocated crossing to the Reach, where some lords might resent the Tyrells' quick alliance with the Lannisters. Ultimately, Gendry decided to focus on solidifying his position. They would target smaller Lannister outposts in the Stormlands, cut off any attempt by the Crown to claim these lands, and attempt to hold them under the banner of the bastard Baratheon. So began a campaign of swift attacks, led by Ser Jon and the other knights, with Gendry frequently riding at the fore. He might lack formal training, but he possessed raw strength and an inspiring presence. Men saw the fury in his swings and the set of his jaw that resembled Robert in his prime. They struck a Lannister encampment near Haystack Hall, surprising them at dawn and routing them completely. Word spread. The Storm Bastard had begun to truly fight. But war is rarely so simple. By the time Gendry had secured a few small victories, House Tyrell dispatched reinforcements to the Stormlands, ironically once loyal to Renly, but now sworn to King Joffrey. The Tyrell banners of gold roses advanced into the region, led by a younger commander eager to prove himself. Gendry soon found his small host tested in a series of skirmishes. The Tyrell cavalry was formidable, their knights shining in half-plate with golden roses on their surcoats. Gendry's men, while determined, often lacked equal armaments. The blacksmith in him raged at their shortage of good steel, but that was the reality of leading a makeshift army. Even so, they fought with fervor, determined to guard the Storm Bastard from harm. Outside a small village on the border of the Reach, an open-field battle nearly broke Gendry's forces. The Tyrell commander had more knights, more archers, and a cunning plan to encircle Gendry's men. Gendry, seeing the trap too late, ordered a desperate charge before the encirclement could close. He rode at the head, his sword raised high, the battered crowned stag on his cloak snapping in the wind. The clash was thunderous. Steel on steel, horses screaming, men shouting. Gendry's sword hacked at the Tyrell line, staggering a knight off his mount. Another knight tried to impale Gendry, but the blacksmith's reflexes were honed by forging. He angled his blade to deflect the thrust and slammed the knight with his shield. They were pressed on all sides, battered by the Tyrell's superior discipline. Yet for all their discipline, the Tyrell men had not accounted for the savage loyalty Gendry's men felt. They fought like cornered boars, refusing to yield. In a swirl of chaos, Gendry found himself unhorsed, rolling in the mud as hoofs thundered past. A Tyrell man-at-arms lunged with a spear. Gendry grabbed the shaft and yanked the man off balance, cracking his helmet with a pommel strike. Blood spattered Gendry's arm. Another attacker came from behind, a flail whistling through the air. Gendry barely had time to duck. His lungs burned, and the coppery taste of fear filled his mouth. He lashed out, swinging wide, and the flail wielder stumbled back, giving Gendry time to stand. He realized he was separated from most of his men, with only a few companions still near. The rest of the field was swirling mayhem. Through the clash, Gendry glimpsed the golden rose banner. The Tyrell commander sat astride a powerful destrier, surveying the fight. Gendry knew that if he could strike down their commander, it might break their morale. Fueled by desperation, he roared a challenge and sprinted through the melee. He had no illusions that a single man on foot could easily unhorse a mounted knight, but the blacksmith's strength was formidable. The Tyrell commander saw him coming and lowered his lance. Gendry dove aside at the last moment, the tip of the lance grazing his shoulder. He rolled in the mud, sprang to his feet, and swung at the horse's flank. The horse reared, whinnying in alarm, and the commander had to fight to control it. In that heartbeat, one of Gendry's knights, a man named Bald John, no relation to Ser John, raced in and slammed the Tyrell's mount with a hammer blow to the armor plating on its neck. It was enough to make the destrier rear again, toppling the commander. Gendry wasted no time. He lunged forward, pressing his sword to the man's throat. "Yield!" he bellowed. Panting, the Tyrell commander glared up at him. But seeing the fight around him going poorly for his immediate guard, the knight grudgingly nodded. Gendry's men, witnessing the surrender, let out a ragged cheer. They had captured the commanding officer, though the cost in blood was high. The Tyrell foot soldiers, suddenly leaderless, began to falter. With a final push, Gendry's battered host drove them from the field. By the day's end, the Storm Bastard was victorious, if only narrowly. The aftermath was grim. Bodies littered the muddy field, and the moans of the wounded filled the air. Gendry moved among the dead, sick with the sight of so many twisted forms. He knelt beside a dying archer, who clutched at Gendry's arm and gasped, "We fight for you. Your father's spirit guides us. Do not let them take the stormlands." Then the man's eyes went blank, and his grip went slack. Gendry felt tears burn the back of his eyes. He had not asked for such loyalty, but it was given all the same, and the weight of it pressed on him. Their victory gave them renewed legitimacy in the eyes of the Stormland lords. Men began to say that Gendry had Robert's strength in battle. The story of him capturing the Tyrell commander on foot against a mounted knight grew with each telling, soon becoming near legend. "He's got his father's fury," they whispered. Meanwhile, Gendry questioned the cost, for a quarter of his men were dead or badly wounded. He knew the Lannisters would not stay idle. Perhaps they had believed him a minor upstart until now, but with this victory, they would realize he was a threat. A large host could be sent to crush him. The only way to counter that would be forging a broader alliance. The captive Tyrell commander was eventually ransomed back to his family for gold and supplies, which Gendry put to good use. He improved the armory, replaced damaged weapons and armor, and stocked the castle's larders for a siege. He also sent word to other Stormland houses still on the fence, inviting them to join him before the Lannisters arrived in force. Some came, spurred by a combination of fear and admiration. Others refused, and Gendry knew a day might come when he would have to wrest their loyalty by force. The realm was fracturing indeed. Throughout this time, Gendry found moments of quiet reflection. He had no illusions that he was a skilled politician or a cunning general. Yet men looked to him for leadership because of the blood in his veins, the memory of Robert. He tried to temper that image with actual kindness. He visited the wounded, spoke with villagers, tried to ensure the small folk were protected from pillaging. If he was indeed a scion of House Baratheon, he wanted to stand for something better than the cruelty of the Lannisters. Word spread that this bastard was just and strong, or at least kinder than most. Small praises in a land overshadowed by war, but they mattered to the common folk. Still, the storms of war were gathering. A raven arrived from the north, this time from Robb Stark himself, who had heard of Gendry's victory. Robb wrote that the North recognized Gendry as a true scion of Robert, though still bastard-born, and if Gendry could deliver enough distraction in the south, the king in the north would push his campaign against the Lannisters harder, ideally relieving the pressure on Gendry's forces. It was not an official alliance proclaiming Gendry as king, but it was enough for Gendry to feel a measure of legitimacy. The bastard of Robert Baratheon was recognized by one of the great kings in the War of the Five Kings. That meant something. Then came the rumors of White Walkers and the terrors beyond the wall, but those were distant threats to the average Stormlander. Gendry, consumed by the immediate war, only heard bits and pieces of the chaos in the far north. He had other concerns. Scouts reported that the Lannisters were on the march from King's Landing, led by none other than Tywin Lannister's trusted generals. Alongside them rode at least some portion of the Kingsguard, possibly including the fearsome Ser Gregor Clegane. The Tyrells had been humiliated at the last battle, so the Lannisters were resolved to crush Gendry with overwhelming force. Spies whispered that a large host, maybe 10,000 men or more, was moving south, picking up reinforcements as they went. Gendry's advisors paled at the news. Their own force might be 3,000 at best, counting levies of questionable training. Holding Greenstone alone seemed impossible if Tywin truly brought the weight of the Crown's armies. They debated retreating inland, possibly trying to slip away, but Gendry's name and face were now well known. There could be no going back to being a simple blacksmith. Men had died for him. He could not abandon them. Nor was there much hope that Stannis would come to his aid, for the man was said to be licking his wounds at Dragonstone, or turning his eyes north after hearing the Red Woman's prophecies. And the north was too distant, embroiled in its own troubles. Gendry had to stand on his own or die trying. It was decided they would not attempt to meet the Lannisters in a grand pitched battle. That would be suicide. Instead, they would engage in a campaign of guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and feints. Hit-and-run strategies aimed at wearing down the enemy, forcing them to divide their forces and chase shadows. Gendry might lack formal training, but he had the cunning of a small folk lad who knew how to move quietly, to disappear into the hills, to strike at weak points. His knights adapted as best they could, though some chafed at the unchivalrous nature of such warfare. "We have no choice," Ser Jon said. "The old ways of meeting on the open field will only lead to our annihilation." And so the Stormlands became a land of skirmishes and sabotage. Gendry's forces struck at Lannister supply caravans, burned siege equipment, and ambushed stragglers in the narrow passes. They avoided direct confrontation with the main Lannister host, melting away into the thick forests. It was a brutal, harrowing kind of warfare that tested everyone's resolve. Villages suffered, caught between the demands of Gendry's men for supplies and the Lannisters' retribution when they suspected villages of harboring the rebels. The once fertile fields were scarred by the tread of thousands of boots and the torches of both sides. Gendry's men risked accusations of banditry. Some unscrupulous soldiers used the war as an excuse to plunder. Whenever Gendry learned of such crimes, he tried to mete out justice, but the chaos made it difficult to maintain strict discipline. One night, as Gendry sheltered in a cave with a group of weary fighters, he looked around at their ragged faces. Men who had once been farmers, blacksmiths, or minor lords. They were all drenched by the storm raging outside. Thunder boomed across the sky, making the cave mouth flicker with lightning. He wondered if Robert's rebellion had ever felt this desperate. Surely Robert had the support of great houses like the Tullis, the Starks, the Arryns. Gendry had, well, a handful of Stormland lords, some leftover knights, and the tenuous promise of recognition from the north. He was bone-tired, his wounds ached, and he suspected that the Lannisters, with all their resources, would eventually trap him. A wave of despair threatened to take hold. But then lightning flashed again, and Gendry recalled the motto that some older Stormlanders had said was the true spirit of their house. "Ours is the fury." It was not about giving up when the odds were long. Robert had once proven that passion and determination could topple even a dynasty. Gendry gritted his teeth and clenched his fists. He might die in the attempt, but he would rather that than surrender to the Lannisters. The next few weeks saw continued skirmishing. Gendry discovered a new reservoir of courage within himself, standing at the front of small raids in the darkness, smashing aside Lannister pickets with his raw strength. Men who followed him admired not only his bloodline but his willingness to share their hardships. He ate the same thin stew as they, slept on the same cold ground. He did not hide behind a retinue of bodyguards, and though they remained outnumbered, they inflicted painful losses on the Lannisters. Rumors reached King's Landing that the bastard of Robert was proving as hard to root out as a weed in the cracks of stone. Ultimately, however, Tywin Lannister did not become one of the greatest warlords in the realm by chance. He adapted, spreading out in smaller, disciplined groups that fanned across the stormlands, methodically capturing keeps, punishing villages that refused them quarter, and forcing Gendry's men to fall back. Slowly, the noose tightened. More stormland houses bent the knee to the crown to avoid total devastation. The once growing tide of recruits for Gendry began to dwindle. He could not feed them properly, nor protect them from Lannister reprisal. Desertions occurred. Despite Gendry's heroic image, reality was crushing. Soon the Lannisters were dangerously close to Greenstone, Gendry's main seat of power. In desperation, Gendry called his principal lords and knights together. They had to decide whether to stand and fight at Greenstone or vanish into the countryside, continuing a guerrilla campaign indefinitely. Some argued that going underground might be best, living to harry the Lannisters for years. Others insisted that the men needed a stand, a pitched defense in a castle to show they would not be cowed. Gendry listened to both sides, torn between the practicality of guerrilla warfare and the symbolic power of defending a stronghold. At last, he made his choice. They would defend Greenstone. If the Lannisters wanted to starve them out, so be it, but they would hold as long as they could. A fortress might offer some advantage, even against a numerically superior foe. He did not wish to live forever in the shadows, scurrying from cave to cave. Perhaps, in holding Greenstone, they might gain time for the northern front to pressure the Lannisters or for some miracle to occur. As the Lannister columns advanced, Gendry's men fortified Greenstone's walls, sharpened stakes, dug trenches, and stockpiled supplies. Archers prepared barrels of pitch to set alight. Gendry himself spent hours in the castle's old forge, repairing broken swords and reshoeing the horses. He felt calm there, sweat rolling down his brow, the clang of metal a familiar lullaby. It reminded him of simpler days in King's Landing. But then he would step out of the smithy and see the ramparts lined with anxious soldiers. The clash of fate was imminent. The day the Lannisters arrived, their banners seemed to cover the horizon. The golden lion on crimson cloth, snapping in the breeze, and row upon row of tents forming an encampment. Scouts reported at least 5,000 men, a fearsome number against Gendry's fraction. The next morning, trumpets sounded outside the castle gates. A Lannister herald arrived, demanding Gendry Baratheon's unconditional surrender. They offered the men leniency if they laid down arms, but for Gendry they promised only the king's justice. The messenger's voice echoed across the battlements. Gendry listened from atop the gatehouse. He saw the lines of Lannister soldiers, the well-armed knights on their destriers, the archers waiting. Surrender might spare his men a bloody end, but it would mean his own doom, and perhaps an example would be made of him. He stepped to the edge of the battlement, called out in a clear, ringing voice, "Tell your masters that if they want me, they must come and take me. Ours is the fury." A cheer went up from his men. The herald turned and rode back. That evening, the siege began in earnest. Catapults flung stones at the walls. Lannister archers launched arrows that hissed through the air, occasionally striking a hapless defender on the ramparts. Gendry's men fired back, raining arrows into the Lannister ranks. For days, the exchange continued, with the Lannisters probing for weaknesses. Assault ladders were hoisted, battered away by the defenders. Fire arrows lit parts of Greenstone's outer buildings. The defenders bravely held them off, but each day their numbers shrank. Finally, the Lannisters assembled a battering ram to break the gate. Under a canopy of wooden shields, they advanced, the ram thudding against the oak and iron of the main gate. Gendry stood on the ramparts, urging his archers to fire relentlessly. Many of the men at the ram died, but the Lannisters replaced them. The gate began to crack. Gendry felt the hopelessness. He strapped on his battered breastplate, took up his sword, and readied himself for a final stand. He refused to hide in the keep. If Greenstone was to fall, he would meet the enemy face to face. His father's rebellious spirit pounded in his veins. The gate splintered, and with a final crash, it broke open. Lannister men-at-arms poured through like a tide. Gendry leapt into the fray, sword swinging in wide arcs, roaring defiance. Around him, loyal knights and footmen fought, but they were battered back step by step. Blood slicked the courtyard. Gendry's arms ached, yet he kept swinging, the crash of steel forming a dissonant symphony. He saw men he recognized, farmers turned fighters, fall beneath the Lannister blades. A haze of smoke filled the air as fires broke out in the stables. Just when it seemed the last line of defenders was about to be overwhelmed, Gendry glimpsed a surge among the Lannister ranks. The men parted briefly, and in rode a knight in white armor, a Kingsguard. His visor was up, revealing a cruel smirk. Ser Meryn Trant, perhaps, or another equally infamous. The man pointed at Gendry, bellowing, "Bring me the bastard of Robert Baratheon." Red fury lit Gendry's vision. He threw himself forward, meeting the knight head-on. The knight's horse whinnied and reared, struck by a thrown spear from somewhere. The knight was forced to dismount. He drew his long sword, sneering at Gendry. "You're no king," he spat, lunging. Their blades met with a clang. Gendry felt the force of the knight's blow, but he parried, then slammed his shoulder forward, forcing the knight back a step. They traded blows in a circle of mud and blood. Gendry took a cut to the thigh, pain lancing through him. He snarled, gritting his teeth. With a desperate heave, he hammered aside the knight's guard and landed a savage blow on the man's helm. The knight staggered, dropping to one knee. Gendry struck again, finishing him. The courtyard was chaos. Another wave of Lannisters poured in. Gendry realized they were doomed. The keep was lost. But in that moment, horns sounded from the distance. It was not the Lannister horn, something else. Gendry's men, as well as the Lannisters, paused briefly, uncertain. Then from the rear of the Lannister lines came a shout of alarm. Over the crest of a nearby hill appeared banners, wolves' heads on a field of gray and white. The North had arrived. A detachment of Robb Stark's men, perhaps, or a band of Northern cavalry. Their charge smashed into the Lannister rear, throwing the lines into disarray. The defenders of Greenstone, seeing this sudden reprieve, rallied with a ragged cheer. Gendry, bloodied and limping, seized the moment. "Push them back," he roared. His men surged forward, hacking at the disorganized Lannisters. The battle turned into a desperate melee, but the surprise northern attack had shattered the siege. After a harrowing hour, the Lannisters broke, retreating from Greenstone to regroup. The battered castle stood, albeit precariously, saved by the timely arrival of northern reinforcements. In the aftermath, Gendry learned that Robb Stark had indeed sent a small force south to open a second front against the Lannisters. Hearing that Tywin had moved men to crush the Storm Bastard, the timing had been near miraculous. Gendry, leaning on his sword, drenched in blood, thanked the commander of the northern party. He realized with a grim smile that if not for his father's blood, none of this might have happened. Fate or the gods had intervened at the final moment, giving him a chance to keep fighting another day. That night, Greenstone's great hall was turned into a makeshift infirmary. Gendry limped among the wounded, offering words of comfort, tears in his eyes for the countless men lost. The northern commander approached him, handing him a sealed letter from Robb Stark. In it, the king in the north formally recognized Gendry as Robert Baratheon's bastard son, and extended a suggestion that if Gendry formally declared for the king in the north against Joffrey, they might cement an alliance that would see Gendry legitimized should they triumph. It was an astonishing proposition. Gendry could hardly believe that from a blacksmith's apprentice, he had risen to a position where a king sought his alliance. But the cost in blood weighed heavy on him. He read the letter by candlelight, his leg throbbing, and whispered to himself, "Father, if only you could see this." Robert Baratheon had been a force of nature, forging the realm through rebellion, and now his unacknowledged son carried that legacy in a new war. Gendry knew the journey ahead would be fraught with more battles, more political maneuvering, and more heartbreak. Yet he set his jaw, remembering the battered warhammer that Robert had once wielded. He felt that same fury coursing through his veins. He would not surrender, for the sake of those who believed in him and for the memory of the father he never knew. Ours was the fury, and it would be again, if Gendry had any say in the matter. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Rain fell in sheets, a storm lashing Greenstone's walls. But inside, by the light of guttering torches, men raised cups of ale or water, toasting the black-haired bastard who might yet shake the foundations of the kingdom. Gendry leaned back, exhausted, his mind churning with possibilities. He had rallied armies, contested Joffrey's claim, and survived a siege by the might of House Lannister. The war was far from won, but the story of Gendry Baratheon had only just begun to be written in the annals of Westeros. And for good or ill, every new chapter would be forged in steel and tempered by the storm.